Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Green Schoolyard Lecture Series. This is the second lecture in the series. We're glad you're here. We know many of you have competing priorities. I know today is a holiday for some, and we're just glad that you're here. Our guest today will be discussing new findings on the historical, social, economic, and cultural factors that led to the implementation of impervious surfaces in California schoolyards, and of course, where we can go from there. Jared Coffelt is a PhD student with the Institute of the Environment and Sustainability at UCLA. His research focuses on how assessment tools can better understand environmental justice impacts. More specifically, he explores how life cycle assessment can incorporate principles of justice to trace the socioeconomic impacts of sustainable infrastructure to produce more equitable outcomes. He is also interested in community engagement and diplomatic processes surrounding infrastructure. He has previously assisted with techno-economic analysis of a prospective clean energy technology, and most recently, tree inventories of Southern California schools. Um, Melody Melody Ng is a urban planning plan, an urban planning PhD student, also at UCLA at the Luskin School of Public Affairs. She focuses on land equity, food sovereignty, environmental justice issues, critical policy analysis, and how legal and socio-cultural systems shape environments. Her other projects include developing a framework for the California legislature to integrate health equity analysis in the bill-making process, examining the environmental justice implications of how California localities are implementing state food waste diversion laws, and developing community-defined metrics to evaluate the determinants of food equity. She received a bachelor's in legal studies and English and a master of public policy from University of California, Berkeley. So we are so delighted that they are here today. And I just want to share that what they're sharing today is just a small piece of other research that they and their colleagues are working on. Today's research is part of a larger study about trees on school campuses in California. And that larger project includes 4 school districts in California, dozens of elementary schools, faculty, postdoctoral researchers, other students from University of California, UCLA, UC Davis, Berkeley, the Forest Service, all in collaboration with other partners like ourselves, like Green Schoolyards America and the California State Urban and Community Forestry Program. Um, some of the objectives of their studies, which cover all sorts of things, cover surveying trees as well as heat research on school campuses. First is to investigate policies that have created and reinforced extensive impervious cover on school grounds and describe land cover patterns on school campuses. Second, to assess tree microclimate benefits and develop future scenarios of such benefits based on varying tree configurations. Third, to assess the vulnerability of campus tree species to climate change. And last but not least, to characterize landscape management perspectives and needs from school principals, teachers, and parents, as well as facility staff at school and district levels and nonprofit greening partners. So Melody and Jared will be presenting about the first objective and data collection for the other components wrapped up this summer. They were very busy this summer. And you can learn more about the project in the link that should be in the chat now. Okay, so that's a lot of information, but I'm happy to pass it off to Jared and Melody. If you have questions for them, please put them in the chat. We will have some time at the end of their presentation to address them either in the chat or live. All right, take it away, Jared and Melody. If you're wondering, that looks great, Melody.
Okay.
We can see
All
it.
right. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Well, thank you for being here. As was mentioned, Jared and I are here to present a brief snapshot of our report, Depaving California Schools for a Greener Future.
Yeah, so to start off, just kind of like why are we doing this research, right? Um, as we all know, there's a lot of initiatives, different programs going on to create more climate resilient infrastructure. Schools have become key targets for such interventions. People are looking at incorporating trees, etc. I'm sure you all know this. And a big problem, though, here in California is that a lot of these schools are covered in some sort of impervious surface that makes it difficult to green. You have to take up that impervious surface before you can plant trees, before you can add green spaces. Um, and just transform schoolyards to make them more enriching and for children, right? And so our work is based on figuring out like why is there so much impervious surface on schools, um, and hopefully providing some recommendations on how to remove that and move forward to greener schools. And so our work was guided largely by these two questions, looking kind of both backwards and then at the current day, at what policies, practices, and other factors contribute to the extensive asphalt and other impervious surfaces in California public schools, and then what policies, practices, and other factors may be keeping those impervious surfaces in place. Go ahead and go to the next slide. Yeah, so this is just a slide kind of demonstrating the extent of the problem, if you will, in California. Um, uh, we mentioned, this is a part of like a larger study, including what was a land cover analysis done on different regions throughout California. And they found that in Los Angeles schools, for example, in the Los Angeles region, that uh, it's almost 60% of school grounds are covered with non-building impervious surfaces, which you can compare to only about 15% of school grounds being covered in some sort of trees or shrubs. On the right, we have a aerial imagery of Van Deen Elementary School, which I believe is within the LA region. And this kind of just demonstrates kind of what like typical California schools look like, right? You have some greenery around the outside, around the perimeter, some between buildings, and then just a lot expansive um, impervious surfaces, concrete, cement, pavement along the interior, even within like the play yards where students spend a lot of like the recess and playtime, physical education classes, etc.
All right. Before we begin talking about our findings, there are some key aspects of California that have affected how and where schools have developed here that need to be discussed. California, as a Western state, is a big state with a lot of land, always has been, still is. Population growth also has been a fairly consistent thing over the decade. Similarly, the student population has grown fairly consistently over the last century, with a few notable dips in the 1930s, the 1970s, and also in more recent years. Portable classrooms, pre-built classrooms that can be moved from location to location, have been commonly used here and in other Western states to manage student overcrowding. The typical climate when schools were first built in California in the late 1800s, even up until the majority of schools were built in the 1960s, was relatively mild, and it remains relatively dry year-round compared to other areas of the US, meaning that many school activities, including lunch and PE, are often done outdoors, and open-air campuses are pretty common. California is also a Pacific Rim state, meaning that earthquakes are an ever-present threat and need to be considered in building construction and maintenance. And lastly, Proposition 13, a constitutional amendment that capped property taxes and limited property assessment increases, has reduced local property tax revenues for education and other public services. However, Proposition 13 is only the tip of the iceberg for how school finance has affected spending in California schools, as you will soon learn. All these factors come into play when trying to understand why schools are designed the way they are and why there's so much hard surfacing in them. What we found in our research indicates that a network of historical policies and events have contributed to the expansive hard surfaces in schools, while current policies and other factors work to keep them in place. The major barriers to depaving, shown in the middle and right columns, include schools needing to prioritize accommodating student population increases and PE standards in land use planning, schools having limited resources to support greener campuses, and also costly and time-consuming approvals processes for projects involving depaving. We'll be summarizing some of these causes shown in the far left column, including but not limited to PE standards, land use planning in schools, education funding, before summarizing some recommendations for how schools can more effectively advance schoolyard greening.
Yeah, so one of the first things we want to talk about, and one of the contributing factors we discovered, I think, fairly early on, is that PE standards and our concepts of play play pretty great influence in how we design schoolyards. And of course, this kind of makes sense because, right, students, especially in California, spend a lot of their playtime outside, and how we think about how they should be playing determines how we develop the facilities and infrastructure to support that play. And kind of what we found actually were some interesting influences going all the way back to really starting with the Civil War, but much more prominent, I think, during World War One, were American leaders were taken aback when they discovered that a lot of the people that they were drafting for military service were just unfit to serve, talking up to like 50% of the people that were drafted. And as a result of this, they implemented a lot of different initiatives, including like PE standards in some places, to create a population that would be more fit to serve for military service. As you can imagine, a lot of these programs and PE standards that were implemented were focused on things that would help prepare students specifically for military service. So they're focused on like organized sports and drills and exercises that would promote traits like discipline, bravery, perseverance, things that are best facilitated not necessarily by open wild spaces, but hard courts and grass fields, right? Kind of on a larger perspective, just more generally as a nation, we've kind of placed this emphasis on organized sports just kind of within the nation itself, right? And this kind of began really late 1800s and early 1900s as well, and kind of continues to the present day. And we see that a lot of PE standards kind of reflect this actually, that even though they don't necessarily mandate competency in a sport, they suggest activities like dribbling a ball that you can pretty quickly connect to some sports. And of course, these activities are also best facilitated by some sort of hard court or grass field, right? Rather than in something areas that are lacking in more advanced vegetation than grass, right? And kind of as a result of this, you actually see that a lot of guides for developing schoolyards are focused around providing the facilities for sports. California has actually recommended minimum hardcourt and playfield surfaces in public schools since the 1960s. These can be found today in the School Site Analysis and Development Guide, which is like the 2000 version of the original 1960s document. And this document itself is referenced in Title V of the California Code of Regulations. So even though hard courts and like play fields, grass fields aren't necessarily mandated per se, they are highly suggested within like California code.
All right, the issue of land use planning. Schools have always had a finite amount of space to achieve all their goals, and figuring out how to optimally use that space in schools has been a pretty enduring struggle. Student overcrowding has been an issue in California since the early 1900s, and accommodating shifting student enrollment has been one of the most influential factors in the history of California's school campus designs. That being the case, why are open-air, one-story campuses so prevalent in California? Wouldn't multi-story buildings be more efficient? Open-air campuses were first popularized in the early 1900s progressive era because education advocates wanted to increase student access to fresh air and sunlight, which they were not getting in big block compact, multi-story buildings. However, open-air campuses have remained a mainstay of school campus designs due to a number of fairly enduring factors over the past century, including concerns about how school design affected student health and development, California's once mild climate, the seismic safety of school buildings, and then, of course, accommodating student overcrowding in schools. Since the 1930s, architectural design trends and state school building seismic safety standards have also compelled schools to expand outward rather than to build vertically. California actually revamped its building safety codes beginning in the late 1920s, after two major earthquakes in Santa Barbara and Long Beach in 1925 and 1933, respectively, that destroyed or damaged many school buildings in the state. This focus around addressing school building safety in the aftermath of these earthquakes culminated in the state passing the Field Act in 1934, which empowered the Department of the State Architect, the DSA, to regulate school building safety and led to more rigorous seismic safety standards for school buildings. These standards also likely encouraged school buildings with fewer stories. As a result, schools likely needed to build outward to accommodate student growth and embraced open planning and underbuilding in some cases on campuses during and after World War II. Flexible open space plans that allowed campuses to serve multiple community uses would become popular during World War II and remain popular post-war. However, the expanded lot sizes needed for open planning resulted in the majority of new schools constructed during this period being located in the suburbs where land was more available and where most new schools continue to be built. The flexible open planning model was important for school administrators who anticipated increased student enrollment in future years with the student boom during those post-war years, and then at the same time, a lack of consistent funding to support new school construction. The state has relied on portable classrooms, portables, to address student overcrowding since the early 1900s, and portables make up roughly 1/3 of classrooms in California schools today. Reliance on portables has been built into the state's school facilities funding policies, which have in the past required certain proportions of classrooms in new schools be portables to receive funding from the state. Portables will therefore likely continue being a key feature of California's efforts to provide enough classrooms for students. In fact, California regulations and standards, specifically Title V, the Education Code, and the California Department of Education School Site Development Guide, referenced earlier, encourage schools to plan their campuses with open areas that can accommodate new structures in the future, and depaving parts of campus and installing more permanent features like trees may require schools to commit to a campus design that has limited adaptability for other future uses. As for why all these open spaces were covered in asphalt, in addition to the longstanding preferences for standards of play in schools, asphalt became a more common surface in the U.S. schools after the start of post-World War II school building boom, 1940s and onward, to around the 1960s, and across the decades during that period and beyond. School administrators were encouraged to asphalt schoolyards to ensure that they could be used intensively by students year-round in all weather conditions, and that they were also easy for school staff to maintain. The gradual paving over of schoolyards may also have been affected by broader cultural preferences in the U.S. related to perceptions of cleanliness in cities, with community members and school administrators seeing paved over surfaces as more orderly looking. It really wasn't until the 1980s that schools began questioning the potential safety hazards of asphalt on playgrounds, but this awareness really hasn't translated into more systematic action being taken to replace asphalt in schools. State school funding system. So insufficient education funding has also prevented schools from maintaining schools at their existing levels, let alone having the means to maintain greener campuses. First of all, school greening projects rely largely on funding reserved for school facilities improvement projects. However, school facilities have never been provided dedicated funding through state or local budgets. Since around 1910, school facilities have relied mostly on local property taxes that must be approved by voters. meaning bond financing for infrastructure projects, but which voters are often reluctant to approve because they are taxes. Schools used to receive more funding from the state to support facilities, as much as 50%, but state support gradually ended after a 1910 state constitutional amendment that abolished the state general property tax and effectively eliminated state property tax revenues as a source of school funding. From then on, schools were limited to taxing local properties to finance education spending. The law was a product of a period during which tax and education spending reform advocates and the general public had turned against the idea of education as a public good requiring state wealth redistribution to finance it. The 1910 law would end up widening school spending disparities between high and low wealth school districts and significantly reducing revenues for schools more generally long before Proposition 13. California also didn't create a program dedicated to funding school facilities improvements until 1976, but also didn't begin funding this program, the school facilities programs that you know today, until 1998. So from that period in the late 1990s till around the Great Recession in 2008, California gradually increased state funding for school facilities, but this largely returned to, after the Great Recession, school districts have largely returned to funding schools primarily through local property taxes. And for example, in the LAUSD, local bonds make up close to 80% of the total school facilities funding. Secondly, maintenance of greener school landscapes will likely impact the staffing and other resources for day-to-day ground maintenance. In addition to the 1910 law, the 1970s anti-tax movement led to policies like Proposition 13 that have gradually decreased overall funding for school operations, which is a distinct category of funding from school facilities. School operations funding goes towards expenses related to both student instruction, like teacher salaries, but also to day-to-day ground maintenance, so salaries for custodial staff. However, the majority of school operations funding is often dedicated to instructional resources like teacher salaries and programming for students for obvious reasons. In fact, budget cuts often lead first to cuts in facility maintenance to reduce their impact on instructional resources for students. While there have been efforts, many efforts over the past 50 years to try to push back against education spending cuts and to promote more equitable school spending, those efforts have really focused mostly on school operations while ignoring school facilities. For example, the state passed the local control funding formula in 2013, a policy meant to equalize school operations spending, but there really is no equivalent policy for school facilities. Overall, how California's education funding system has been set up has resulted in insufficient funding to maintain school facilities and has likely contributed to schools prioritizing easy to maintain campus designs like hard surfaces with no vegetation. Okay, school building codes. State and local approvals processes for large-scale school greening projects are also informed by state school building safety regulations. However, California school building codes may unintentionally create administrative barriers to depaving. School greening projects that require hard surface removal may trigger certain school building safety (DSA) review processes that make school greening projects administratively burdensome and also costly. Two particular state-level regulations have been noted as a major barrier to depaving. First, school construction projects that alter school facilities that require a path of travel through the areas altered by a project to comply with ADA requirements. While state law limits the cost of providing a path of travel to 20% of the total project budget, budgets that exceed a certain cost don't qualify for this limit, and depaving projects, which tend to be larger, are likely to push budgets over this exemption limit. Second, when school improvement projects exceed $100,000, and typically larger projects, they trigger a comprehensive safety review of school buildings that may be impacted by the project. This is meant to ensure that when schools make significant investments to alter their buildings, any outstanding safety concerns for those buildings are also addressed. But because of the many school facilities funding issues that were brought up earlier, many California schools have not been well maintained and they have backlogs of deferred maintenance projects. So as a result, schools might be required to rehab structures that aren't up to code before they can proceed with some greening projects. And this can significantly increase a project's budget if what you're paying for now is also backlogged maintenance projects. The DSA, which created these regulations, has an outsized role in approving greening projects that required paving. They were empowered, as was mentioned previously, to oversee all school facilities, construction, and improvements in California through the Field Act in 1934. Building safety standards for schools developed through the Field Act were even more stringent than the standards covering most types of other buildings in the state. At the local level, school districts may also have additional processes to approve school greening projects. District facilities departments are often responsible for overseeing how school facilities funding that they get from the state and from local bonds is spent and developing local approvals processes for greening projects. So they hold significant influence over the planning and implementation of these types of projects. So in sum, the success of school greening projects really depends on school districts and school greening advocates' ability to navigate both DSA regulations, state level DSA regulations, but also local school planning processes for school greening projects.
Picture took a second to load. Okay, so speaking of funding, right, one of the good things actually about greening programs, I think particularly in schools, is that greening can be a co-benefit of a lot of different climate resilient programs. And so because of that, you can get funding from a lot of different places. One of the ones that we found was quite common with school greening projects actually was stormwater management programs that are designed to provide funds to promote projects that can capture, utilize, and properly discharge stormwater. Um, and as you can kind of see from this picture here on the left-hand side, this is from, I believe, Normandy Elementary School that actually received money from a stormwater program where they were able to tear up some of their pavement and replace that with like bioswales and a lot of different green infrastructure, right, including trees. So there's all these great funding opportunities. We kind of have a few examples here of different like stormwater management program funds that have been developed over the year and what their purpose was. The problem is that even though these exist, few schools have actually taken advantage of them. And Melody, if you can go to the next slide, please. And so, like, why is that? Why do we have these funds that are out there, but schools aren't using them as much as they should? And I do want to mention that while this is based on stormwater management programs, this also applies to other grants as well of similar nature, including like CAL FIRE grants. So what are these barriers, right, that we're talking about? One of the biggest ones is liability and safety concerns, which is kind of just a common thread with schools in California. Particularly, they're concerned, right, that in this case, they're going to have to handle offsite water. And what happens if they contaminate the school grounds or contaminate nearby grounds, right? They're afraid that they'll be held liable for that and have to come out of their pocket in order to pay for cleaning that up. In some cases, fears particularly of triggering Superfund protocols. Maintenance and funding issues are also an issue. Oftentimes, there's lack of long-term maintenance plans. It's costly to do this, and there's also just concerns about sourcing the proper skilled labor and in order to maintain such new infrastructure. Application processes for such grants can often be tedious and unclear, oftentimes very resource intensive. A lot of them require feasibility studies that can be quite taxing for schools to take on. And even though some programs offer, for instance, technical assistance programs, in order to help complete these requirements, these programs are often underfunded, and so it really doesn't make much of a difference. Sometimes there are differences between the objectives and school district and program objectives. And this really becomes an issue for schools because they're just not really sure how to put forth a competitive application. Sometimes they're not prioritizing the same thing that the program wants to prioritize, and so they receive fewer points. But sometimes the issue just comes from structurally and systematically, people tend to undervalue the benefits that schools can offer by incorporating stormwater management into their campuses. Another issue, and this is one particularly also found with like CAL FIRE grants, is the reimbursement model of funding where the funds for that are awarded for grants aren't awarded until near the completion of the project, and so this forces the people that are undertaking the project to fund the project up front, which can be prohibitive in some cases. And then finally, the last thing that we really wanted to focus on is just a lack of regulatory incentive. There are what they call Phase 2 Small Municipal Separate Stormwater Sewer System, or MS4 regulations. It's quite the mouthful. And essentially what these are is like some sort of regulation for permit holders that regulates the type and the quantities of offloads that they can have off of their land. And so what ends up happening is these aren't actually applied to schools. And so schools don't have to comply with this. And because of that, they don't really have any incentive to comply with, to reduce the amount of pavement on their grounds in order to manage stormwater, which also limits the ability to green because of that. And so focusing on, you know, addressing these barriers is a good way to access those funds.
All right. So after hearing everything, it's easy to assume that the odds are stacked against greening, and in some ways they are, but that hasn't stopped greening from happening, as you can see here on this slide, showing a transformation of Normandy Avenue Elementary in LAUSD from 2017 to 2022 through a partnership with LAUSD and other critical greening partners, including Council for Watershed Health. But to get from the before, the pavement that you see, to the after, more green, schools and school greening advocates will need to take action to address both perceived and also actual barriers to school greening. So here are some recommendations to consider to guide future action.
Yeah, so kind of starting off with where we began, standards of play. We really should just expand our PE recommendations and standards to focus not just on activities like dribbling a ball, but to be more flexible, right? To test these competencies, things like hand-eye coordination in other ways. But just from a larger perspective, we also just need to embrace more ideas of what play actually means for children, less organized play, structured play with rules in sports, even though sports are, I enjoy sports myself, but exploratory play is very important for children's development. Um, Encourage them to get out to adventure and then provide the spaces, the natural spaces that encourage that type of play. And by doing that, you will also be able to implement more natural spaces on campus. The second thing that we want to talk about is leveraging stormwater management programs. And this kind of takes on two different ideas. First, schools should just take advantage of these programs and the funds that are offered. But also, when it comes to regulations that aren't applied to schools, like those MS4 regulations, begin to actually make sure that schools have to comply with that. Because when you do that, they're encouraged to incentivize, they're encouraged to depave. There are also other similar programs, for instance, like Measure W, which is a parcel tax on impervious surfaces that is also not applied to schools. Applying similar things like that to schools also applies a financial incentive because schools would want to reduce costs by depaving, and so then they don't have to pay that tax every year, right? And then finally, and this is kind of related to, finally out of this section of recommendations, address the common barriers and other sources of schoolyard funding, right? So make applications a little bit more flexible and accessible to schools. Alongside this, making sure that the people that are running these grant programs understand the benefits that come with depaving on schools and greening schools, right? That they can be as beneficial as other projects done in other locations. This also requires education of the public on the benefits that schools can offer.
All right. Land use planning in school. So as you heard, many state standards related to the design of school facilities seem to encourage schools to design campuses that will be able to accommodate additional structures in the future without requiring too many significant changes. So the state leaves some room for leeway in these standards. In practice, schools have interpreted these standards pretty rigidly, leading them to narrowly prioritize class sizes and PE spaces when site planning for schools in a way that might discourage campus screening. The California Department of Education could update the site development guide and amend Title V to clarify how schools might reconcile planning greener schools with ensuring that there are enough classroom and PE spaces. Nonprofit greening partners might also consider working with schools to engage in more creative school site planning that satisfies school land use planning requirements. For example, encouraging multi-use green landscapes that treat outdoor classrooms as simultaneous play areas so that they're not just discrete areas of use. As for funding for school facilities, the school facilities program remains the primary source of funding for school construction projects, including school greening projects, even though the budget for this program has been waning over the years. It would require significant major reforms to become a reliable source of funding for school greening and depaving projects. The school facilities program was always meant to incentivize school districts to raise local funds for schools by promising school facilities, by promising matching state funds, but this is a challenge for lower wealth school districts. Up to 40% of them in the state are unable to raise enough local funds to cover basic school facilities repairs, let alone funding for school greening projects. Moreover, most funding in this program seems to go to new school construction, and school administrators have often noted that the amounts provided for improvements are not enough for basic repairs, let alone advances in landscapes like greener schoolyards. Efforts would need to be made to increase dedicated state funding for the program and to direct more of that overall funding to school renovations so that schools aren't so reliant on local property taxes to fund their school facilities improvements. However, ensuring that there's enough funding to maintain these green spaces would also require increases in school funding overall. Bonds can't be used to pay for the continued maintenance of green schoolyards. Day-to-day maintenance of greening projects must be paid for through school operations budget, the salaries for maintenance staff. However, due to decades-long disinvestment in California, which we've covered in schools, there are now likely fewer resources, fewer maintenance staff to service a growing stock of pretty poorly maintained schools. Schools need more funding, period, to support long-term maintenance of greener schools. It's not particularly original to say, but feels important to emphasize. Lastly, the cooperation of local school districts is essential. School districts' facilities departments are ultimately the ones that determine how the state and local funding they get will be spent. The processes they develop to manage school greening will ultimately affect whether school greening projects happen. So it's important to work with them to develop processes that support greening. Thank you for your time, everyone.
Thank you, Melody, and thank you, Jared. That was a wonderful overview and a very helpful resource, especially for folks that are wondering about the complexities of funding and how we got to where we are. That was a really great overview. Really impressed. We do have some questions. Oh, and also, yeah, reiterating that schools need more funding, period, and that facilities can help prioritize greening 100%. Yes. So a few questions. Carolyn was asking about, I don't know if she was asking about the funding opportunities that you mentioned specifically or more broadly. Are they dependent on the economic situation of the school? I know that's true for some, but not all. I don't know if there's a couple examples you could give. Oh, yes, the ones that you mentioned in California. So
Sorry,
I think that would be, yeah. So programs like the DROPS program and other funding sources, are they
ah,
dependent on the economics of the school?
I see. Yes. So from my understanding, not usually technically, but what factors into this is again the difficulty of undertaking these applications. And so what you find is that it actually ends up being that schools that are perhaps a little bit wealthier or schools that have just a more dedicated like parental base or volunteers, people with the time to do so, end up applying for these programs. Um, so you'll find kind of the schools that are already more dedicated to student success and greener schools tend to actually take advantage of this rather than um, uh, these being locked behind like um, the schools that tend to have less money are less able to take advantage of these usually just is kind of the way it goes.
Okay, that does make sense. All right, another question. Let's see. And I was actually wondering this too, if there's anything more you can say about other uh other ecological systems that can kind of be layered with the funding. Carolyn is asking about gray water systems and would they qualify? Um, but if there's anything more to add about like um, funding sources that reduce heat, for example, that could be, you could say, well, we can get there by way of a green schoolyard.
Right. I can't really name any specifically, but I know that there are from what I've seen there are numerous grants across like a variety of different climate related fields that you could probably apply for. And green in that process. Specifically regarding gray water, again, not an excerpt, but I don't believe that gray water is something that you can usually get grants for. And if I might be thinking of something else, but if I recall correctly, that's another thing that schools are particularly cautious about. And there's also, I think, kind of a taboo around using gray water anyway. So whatever that may be. So you can probably find some grants, but it's not something that really applies to like the stormwater, et cetera, that we've seen.
Yes. I know in this area in Southern California, the Gray Water Corps is doing a lot of great work. And I think they do some education at schools, but I'm not sure if they implement projects, but I'd be curious to learn more about that. Um, Annie is asking, so given all of these barriers, where do you see most efforts being successful in terms of scale and level? So at the school community level, district, the watershed, region, state, where can people uh, leverage these efforts best?
I think what we've heard from talking to other people doing this work is that the locally driven efforts, having school districts that are extremely supportive of the work really helps. Again, just want to emphasize that last point, the cooperation of local school facilities districts. They hold the purse strings essentially. They may get the funding, but they determine how all of that is spent. So when you have staff or a leader in the facilities department, or just a culture of wanting to support greening, because they're the ones in the end who have to deal with figuring out how to maintain a lot of these spaces in the schools. That's that's why their support is so critical. And when these efforts have been successful, it seems like a combination of strong supporters within the school district department or within a school itself. So we've seen, I think strategically it's finding specific partners in an area in a school or in a school district and trying to figure out how to work together to secure some of the funding opportunities through stormwater and other opportunities that are available apart from schools, the funding that doesn't seem to be available anymore through the school facilities program would probably be the most strategic approach, or at least that's what seems to have happened in some of these cases where this has happened despite this environment that we're talking about that essentially makes a lot of this work an uphill climb.
All of that makes sense. And yeah, and depending where you are, you could have some really, a district that is really collaborative and wants to try new things, or the reverse, or, maybe there's teachers and principals that want to pilot certain things, but others on board. So a little trial and error. Okay, so someone else is asking, this is my colleague Alejandra, who works with Green Schoolyards. Are you allowed to mention who you collaborated with on this study? And if not, we can share that later. I know there's some federal overlap stuff going on right now. So
As far as like school districts, I'm
or
in some
general areas, maybe.
general areas.
Yeah.
It was, what are the three? I'm trying to remember
The Sacramento area,
yeah,
some districts in the Bay Area, not going to get more specific than that, and then some
and
districts in the
Coffelt,
LA area, not going to be more specific than that.
Okay. Um,
If you inquire though, we might be able to see if we can provide more information on that.
yeah, I understand. Okay, so this is kind of a long one.
Oh, sorry, real quick.
Yeah.
I do have to leave. I think we talked about this
That's
before. I do
fine.
have class. I have to teach at noon. But I do want to thank you all for your time. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having us. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. But thank you all.
Yes, thank you, Jared. Good luck in class. So just in our last few minutes, there's just a couple more questions. Katie's ask is sharing a little background. I'm currently researching the history of school greening in California and seeing three clear waves in the last century: wartime school greening efforts being the first two, framing greening around civic duty / victory in gardens, and in the last 10, 15 years being the third major wave, framing greening around equity and climate resilience. Would you say this is true, or am I missing some major movements in these efforts?
I would say that I'm not an expert in that. That sounds pretty accurate to me. What was the second movement?
The second
First,
around civic, like greening and gardening around civic duty.
that was during the post-war period or the World War II. What was the first period? Sorry.
Wartime and let's
So,
see, wartime
World War
school
One,
greening efforts.
World War One, World War II, and then now.
Mm-hmm.
I'm no expert in this field. I think at this point you probably know more than me, but that does sound pretty accurate based on what the information we came across through this project.
Okay. Let's see if there's any other questions. I think that's about it. Is there anyone from my own staff that has any questions? You're welcome to just unmute yourselves. I do know that the U.S. Forest.
Great. Oh, sorry,
Yeah.
Lauren. This is Alejandra. It would be great to get I think a link to where you have this article posted in case people want to see more.
The report?
Yeah, the report.
Oh, is it? Sorry, I didn't. Okay.
Yes, I think we can reshare the report.
Oh, okay, you shared it. Sorry.
Yeah, we shared it at the beginning and we can reshare. I'll reshare it now.
Thank you. That was wonderful.
And yes, and we have they have collaborated with Green Schoolyards America on some of this work, and it's been great to work with you.
Sorry, I had a late flash to the last question.
Yeah.
I don't know that this is true. This is actually just, I'm drawing on some other research that I'm doing, sort of unrelated to this project, but I would also maybe look into the 1980s. It might just blend into this current period, just be maybe an early period that's part of this current period with the focus on greening for climate resiliency, but there was a movement starting, I think, in the late 80s to the 90s around sustainable development. That's when it kind of became in vogue in urban planning, where they were starting to think about greening as a category of development or a goal that cities should focus on as well, in addition to other things like economic development, which were kind of at the fore before. So I might recommend maybe seeing, or if you have some research on that that's already sort of in your archive of things you're reading, to look back into that to see whether there might be a distinction between these two periods, or whether they're essentially just one long period that just sort of where everything is escalating kind of in the last couple decades.
Yeah. So again, thank you, Melody, and thank you, Jared, who's not here. And it's been a delight to collaborate with you on this study and with your other colleagues. And we can't wait to hear about the work from the summertime.